In this lecture, you will learn how to solve quadratic equations by factoring and the quadratic formula. So a quadratic equation or a second degree equation can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a cannot equal 0. Now if a was 0, then that will eliminate this entire first term, and you wouldn't have a second degree equation anymore. It would be a linear equation, so that's why a cannot equal 0. Let's solve by factoring. 2x squared minus x equals 1. So you've learned some steps in the previous weeks about solving quadratic equations that look like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. We're going to follow the steps to your right over here. Make sure everything is on one side, factor, set each factor to 0, and then solve for the variable. So let's get started. First thing we need to do is make sure everything is on one side. So in order to do that, we need to subtract 1 from both sides. Then we'll have 2x squared minus x minus 1 equals 0. So that's the very first step. Then we're going to factor. Now, this is a trinomial, so you'll need to use one of your factoring methods to factor this trinomial. Now, I've introduced you to the AC method. So what I want you to do is I want you to work on the AC method, and of course that is multiplying a times c first and then coming up with factors that will work so that it will add to -1 in the middle. So pause the video, and after you're done, I want you to have come up with the factors that end up looking like this, 2 binomials. So hopefully you have done that already. I'm going to go ahead and put some factors here. 2x plus 1 times x minus 1. So hopefully you ended up with something that looks like this. And when you multiply, you can check it. So that's 2x squared. That's negative 2x1. Negative 2x times plus 1x. Negative 1. So that works. So hopefully you had either 2x plus 1 times x minus 1 or x minus 1 times 2x plus 1. It's the same thing. Now, third step, set each factor to 0. So 2x plus 1 equals 0 or x minus 1 equals 0. Now we're going to solve for x. So we got to subtract 1 from both sides. Then we're going to divide both sides by 2 to get -1/2 as one of the solutions. Then on the right here, we're going to add 1 to both sides. We get x equals +1. So here we have 2 solutions, and we should, because our degree is 2. Degree meaning highest exponent. The next problem, again, we have to get everything on the left side, on one side here. So let's add 3 to both sides. We have 5x squared plus 8x plus 3 equals 0. And then when we factor, of course, make sure you use the AC method. Pause the video and write down what the factors are. So hopefully you pause the video by now and you have come up with factors for this problem. So 5x plus 3 times x plus 1. Always check it. 5x squared plus 5x plus 3x plus 3. That works out. Now we need to set each factor to 0. Then we're going to subtract 3 here. 5x equals -3. Divide by 5. So one solution is -3/5. And we're going to subtract 1 on this side, and the other solution is -1. Now let's talk about the quadratic equation by using the quadratic formula. So this is the quadratic formula to your left. It is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And the story goes a little like this. If you want a quirky way to remember it, there once was a negative boy. So let's go ahead and put x equal. There once was a negative boy who could not decide, yes or no, whether he wanted to go to a radical party. The boy was a square, so he missed out on 4 awesome chicks, and the party was all over by 2 a.m. So if you can remember that quirky story, you can possibly figure out what the quadratic formula is without trying to find it to solve these particular equations. So the quadratic formula solves quadratic equations of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So notice that in this equation, I have the a, b, and c sort of highlighted or in red to stand out, because we need the a, b, and c in order to put a, b, and c into the formula. So we're going to make substitutions for what a, b, and c are. In order to do that, however, we need to get everything on the left side, or on one side, like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So this is the format you need to begin with before you decide what a is, b is, and c is. All right, let's begin. Notice that number 1 is the same problem we did before, 2x squared minus x equals 1. So the first thing we need to do is subtract 1 so that we can get it in the form to determine what is a, b, and c. So if you notice, our a is 2, our b is negative 1, and never use the variables for your a, b, and c, because people always say x when they see something like this, but we're talking about coefficients and constants, not variables. And then c is negative 1 as well. So a is 2, b is negative 1, c is negative 1. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put a, b, and c into our formula. So we have x equals negative b, and b is negative 1 plus or minus the square root of, b again is negative 1 squared minus 4 times a, and I'm following this formula above here, 2 times c, c is negative 1. All over. Make sure you extend this line to cover the entire numerator, or else it's technically not right. So for example, if you only put half of this on top of that line, then this is technically not right. All of this is being divided by 2a. So we have all of this divided by 2 times a, and a is 2 in this case. All right, let's begin simplifying. So this part here, where we have negative of a negative 1, that is a positive 1. So I'm just going to write 1 here, plus or minus the square root of, all right, and then we have negative 1 squared here. So that's positive 1. So negative 1 squared is positive 1. And then notice that we have a negative 4 times 2 times negative 1. So that negative times that negative there would end up being a positive. So determine if it's a positive or negative before you write down the product. And the product here is 8, because 4 times 2 times 1 is 8, divided by 4. And we're going to continue to simplify this. So now we have 1 plus or minus the square root of 9 over 4. And 1 plus or minus the square root of 9 is 3. So we'll replace that with 3. So here we have two situations where we break up the problem. We simplify as much as possible until we get to this point. One solution is 1 plus 3 over 4, and we'll work on that. And the other solution will be 1 minus 3 over 4. So notice that we only changed, we have two solutions. That's what that plus or minus represents, that there will be two solutions in the end. One with a plus and one with a minus. So when we continue, 1 plus 3 is 4 over 4. So we have 1. And 1 minus 3 is negative 2 over 4, which is negative 1/2. So is that the same answer that we arrived at on the first page? And it is. We have negative 1/2 and we have positive 1. So just showing you this is another method of solving quadratic equations, and it's especially useful when you cannot factor the trinomial. You still have solutions to the quadratic equations even if you can't factor the trinomial. All right, let's practice on number 2. It's probably best if you go ahead and attempt it first, pause the video, and then play it back. So hopefully you completed the problem. You added 3 first. Hopefully we have 5x squared plus 8x plus 3 equals 0. So 5 is, A is 5, B is 8, and C is 3. So in the quadratic formula, you have negative B, and that is 8, plus or minus the square root of 8 squared, minus 4 times A times C. A is 5, C is 3. All divided by, make sure you extend that line even over the negative 8 plus or minus, divided by 2 times 5. Then you have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of, we know that 8 squared is 64, minus, because there's only one minus, no negatives on the right over here, only this minus in the middle. 4 times 5 is 20, and 20 times 3 is 60, divided by 10. And now you have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 4 over 10, because 64 minus 60 is 4. Let's continue. We have a negative 8 plus or minus 2, since the square root of 4 is 2. And here's when we have where we can split up into two answers. Negative 8 plus 2 over 10. And what's the other way to split it up? Negative 8 minus 2 over 10. Since these are regular numbers, we can continue. Negative 8 plus 2 is negative 6 over 10, which reduces to negative 3/5. And negative 8 minus 2 is negative 10 over 10, which reduces to negative 1. So is that the same answer as before? It is negative 3/5 and negative 1. So now that we've proven that the quadratic formula actually works, let's go to a problem like number 3, where notice, can you factor x squared plus 5x plus 2 equals 0? If you said no, you are correct, because there are no factors of 2 that add up to 5. So you cannot factor this. In this case, you must use another method, and we're going to use the quadratic formula to come up with the solutions to this problem. Now first, we notice everything is on the same side, so we're good there. But now we need to determine the A, which is 1, the B, which is 5, and C, which is 2. So x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times 2, all over 2 times A, which is 1. Then we're going to continue to simplify this until we can't simplify it any further. So that's negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared is 25 minus 4 times 1 times 2 is 8. All divided by 2. Then you have negative 5 plus or minus the square root of, what is 25 minus 8? 25 minus 8. 17 over 2. Now notice we cannot simplify the square root of 17. Why is that? It does not contain any perfect square factors. So because of that, and because there's nothing else to simplify here, there's nothing else to make smaller, break down, then our two solutions are negative 5 plus radical 17 all over 2, and also negative 5 minus radical 17 all over 2. So these are our two solutions. All right, moving on to the next one. And of course, you could pause the video now and just work all the problems out to determine if you understand it. All right, so next we have A equals 1, B equals negative 2, C equals negative 4. So we have X equals negative 2. And notice that I write out everything on the first try, on the first attempt. Write all the negatives out, all the numbers out. Don't try to simplify and then you don't realize. You kind of want to have, you can go back and have documentation that you actually did simplify something. So you want to make sure the documentation is there first before you start simplifying. So you can go back, and if you make a mistake, you can determine what that mistake is, and everything is written out first. So B squared would be negative 2 squared minus 4 times A 1 times C negative 4 all over 2 times A. Now did you extend that line to everything to the right of that equal sign should have a line under it. Now let's start simplifying, because the negative of a negative 2 is a positive 2. So we'll just simply write 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared is positive 4. Now what should be our sign that goes after this 4? Now if you said plus, then you are right. Plus 16 all over 2. Now let's continue. We have 2 plus or minus the square root of 20 all over 2, since 4 plus 16 is 20. Now here's a different case, because 20 actually contains a perfect square factor of 4. So we're definitely going to have to break out that perfect square. You're going to have to break out of that radical. So because square root of 4 is 2, it needs to go on the outside of that radical, and that 5 remains under. Now here's the situation whenever you have these three numbers here, 1, 2, 3, these three where I'm pointing to, numbers outside of the radical, number on the left with a plus or minus, and a number in the bottom, that can be reduced. Or best way to say is, can we divide these three numbers by the same number and we can reduce it evenly? Can 2, 2, 2 be divided by a number and it reduce? Yeah, of course, it will be 2, right? So what we do is we divide this 2 here by 2, that'll be 1 plus or minus. Divide this 2 by 2, that will also be 1. Now we don't write that 1 there, all right? So I'm going to erase it, because we don't normally write the 1 there, because it's understood to be 1 times the square root of 5. And then 2 divided by this 2 is also 1. So that's how you simplify when you get to something that looks like this. All three numbers must be divided by the same number. to simplify. All right, so notice in the denominator here we have a 1. That's not even necessary, right? So really you have your answer is 1 plus or minus the square root of 5. If you want to break that up, then one of your solutions is 1 plus the square root of 5, and the other solution is 1 minus the square root of 5. All right, moving on to the next problem. Everything is on the right side. So A equals 2, B equals 4, and C equals -3. So x equals -4 plus or minus the square root of 4 squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A. So we have -4 plus or minus the square root. What goes under that radical? You have 16, and what would be your sign here? Plus, and what would be the number that goes after the plus? 24. So if you said 24, you are correct, divided by 4. So now you have a -4 plus or minus the square root of 40 over 4. So I would challenge you to simplifying this by first simplifying that radical and then simplifying that entire expression. So hopefully you've done that. You paused the video already. It's best to build your confidence by trying it out yourself first, because I've had a lot of students to say, when you're doing it, it seems so easy. But you have to do it because you're taking the test. I'm not taking the test. You have to take the test, and you have to prove that you know the steps, you know what to do without me telling you what to do or without a video telling you what to do. All right. So hopefully you broke up 40 as 4 times 10, because the perfect square is 4 and 40. And here you have 4 plus or minus. The square root of 4 is 2. So we take that out. And here's the situation where we were before, where we have a situation where all 3 numbers can be divided by the same number. So what number can divide into all of these numbers evenly? And it has, again, to be all 3. It can't be 2 numbers. It has to be all 3 numbers in order to simplify this. So it looks like 2 can divide into all. So 2 goes in -4. That'll be -2 plus or minus. 2 goes in 2 is 1. And again, we don't write the 1 there, so I'm going to erase it, because 1 times radical 10 is just radical 10 divided by 4. 2 divided into 4 is 2. So here's your solution. And again, you can't do anything with this because these are just 2 numbers, right? It has to be all 3 numbers. So therefore you can't simplify further than this. Now there's another way this expression can be written, but for now I want you to write it like so. So how do you write the 2 different solutions out? You write -2 plus radical 10 all over 2, or -2 minus radical 10 all over 2. So those are the 2 solutions. All right, let's look at this one, because this is set up differently. But how do we know it's a quadratic equation so that you can use the quadratic formula? Well, if you just simply multiply this, you already see there's a 3n squared. This square is telling me that this is a possible quadratic equation. So when you multiply that out, then we're going to move everything to the same side. So that's 3n squared minus 10n minus 25 equals 0. And of course, again, you could use other methods to solve the quadratic equation. On this one in particular, you definitely could have factored this one to get the solution if you prefer factoring, because this is a factorable trinomial. However, let's practice using the quadratic formula. So A here is 3, B equals negative 10, and C equals negative 25. So we have x equals negative b, and b here is negative 10 plus or minus the square root of negative 10 squared minus 4 times a times c, which is negative 25, all over 2 times 3. All right, let's begin with this negative 10, negative of a negative 10, positive 10 plus or minus the square root of 100 plus 4 times 3 times 25, 300, all over 6. All right, do you think you can finish it? If so, pause the video and play once you are done. All right, hopefully you have paused. So now we have 10 plus or minus the square root of 400 all over 6. And then 10 plus or minus, now that 400 is a huge number. You may have broken it down as 4 times 100, but notice 4 and 100 are perfect squares, correct? So really that would be the square root of 4 times the square root of 100, which is 2 times 10. Or maybe you even notice that 400 is a perfect square itself. So if you put in your calculator the square root of 400, you're still going to get 20, no matter how you decide to simplify. You should break it all the way down to 20. So here we have 10 plus 20 over 6, and you also have 10 minus 20 over 6. So when you notice there are no radicals left in your problem, that's an indication that you could have factored the problem. When you notice like above here, notice that we weren't able to get rid of those radicals, and that's the case when you know that you could not have factored that trinomial. So we have 10 plus 20, which is 30 over 6, which equals 5, and 10 minus 20, which is negative 10 over 6, and we can reduce that to negative 5/3. This concludes the lesson on solving quadratic equations. First, reviewing how to use the factoring method to solve quadratic equations, but also to use the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations.